6. So we will take what we can get. Hi there, welcome everybody. My name is Patrick O'Neill. I'm a professor in the history department here at Methodist University, and I'm delighted to be here for the afternoon session of the symposium. What will be our panel's topic is Between War and Peace, which is sort of wonderful and I suppose a decent encapsulation of all human history. And our presenters here are Hallie Smith from the History and Communications Department, and Mujahed Aghbar from, am I right in saying sociology? Economics, sounds good. Okay, perfect. Okay, we are very happy that you've shown up, or perhaps that you're watching this after the fact. What we will do is Hallie will present first, and then we will, if she takes less than 20 minutes, we will ask her questions and give her a chance to answer them. And then Mujahed will present at 1:20 and not before, so we might end up taking a break. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat. And I believe I criticized or was unhappy with that decision in a previous thing, and yet now I understand exactly why, because we want to be muting our computers at the right time. So if you have questions, put them in the chat. You can either chat them to me, Patrick O'Neill, or you can just put them in the everyone chat, and we will attempt to give our presenters a chance to answer them as they go. So without further ado, I will turn the Hallie Smith, who will be delivering a paper entitled "The Liberator's Presentation of Slavery and the South."
The Liberator newspaper ran from 1831 up until the Civil War was completed in 1865. It was a widely acknowledged abolitionist newspaper in its time, and today it's recognized for the achievements it made and how strongly its push was for the anti-slavery movement. Today we're going to be discussing how it tailored a narrative that did more than just turn Northern whites against slavery, but it also fueled the idea that the entire culture of the South was important. Not only that, it was so deeply intertwined with slavery, and that slavery itself posed a threat to the whole American system, that a war against it was justified and necessary. That's a radical statement they can't make immediately. So it's this progression over time, over a 30-year time span, that makes the movement possible. In the first year of its running, the editors Garrison and Knapp wrote an article entitled "Prospectus of the Liberator." This was declaring its purpose, saying what exactly they intended to do with their paper. They stated, "It is the design of the Liberator to overthrow this horrible servitude and to break these fetters. We expect to conquer through the majesty of public opinion. As slavery in its origin was a national crime, so likewise is removal a national duty." This proclamation makes their end goal of abolition clear, but what we want to focus on today is how exactly they achieve that. This statement says that they know they can't count on legislative action taken unprompted. It also states that they know there's no instant expectation of these relatively impassive Northerners to suddenly take up arms against their Southern counterparts. They know they have to gradually introduce the Northerners into their ideology. Starting with 1831, with its first handful of publications, the Liberator describes the foundation of distaste for slave owners, and it encourages its readers to feel the same. This is shown in editor O'Connell's statement that, of all men living, an American citizen who is the owner of slaves is the most despicable. He is a political hypocrite of the very worst description. This statement serves to describe what exactly they see the slave owner as a threat to. It's not so much a threat to the individuals whom they impact, but to the political system and to the larger picture. What he's worried about is the threat they pose to the government and to the whole groundwork of the nation. But they can't say this just yet because that sounds ridiculous and radical. They have to build on that idea and expand it over time. next statement that we find about slaveholders further dehumanizes them, and it displays them as not just a political foe, but as a true criminal. On January 3rd of 1836, the Liberator contained an article stating, "He whose hands are not referred to whiteness may be usefully employed in cleaning up the blood of our southern slaughterhouse. A robber may arrest the hand of an assassin. A murderer may reprove a slaveholder, for he is the slayer of both soul and body." This statement depicts slave owners, as I said, not just as a political foe, but also as the very worst of a human criminal. It's sort of saying that, it's pretty bad whatever you've done, but it's not worse than what they're doing. It's saying that no matter what you've done, it's worth it to go after these guys. They're worthy being prosecuted. They're bad. Like, they're plain and simple. They are very bad. They're a threat that needs to be put down. There's something to be afraid of. You don't let serial killers and sociopaths run rampant, so why should you let slave owners? In April of 1836, the Liberator reminded its readers that allowing slavery to continue in the South would potentially allow themselves to become enslaved down the line. The paper quotes Reverend C.G. Finney as saying, "The individual who will enslave his fellow men for his own selfish objects would enslave others, any or all, if his interests demand. The individual who will deprive a black man of his liberty and enslave him would make no scruple to enslave a white man if circumstances were equally favorable. The man who contends that the black laborer of the South ought to be held in slavery, if he dared, would contend to have the white laborers of the North enslaved. It is not principle that keeps men who hold slaves from kidnapping on the coast of Africa, or from making a war to enslave the free laborers of the North." This statement makes slaveholding something of a business practice, a practical investment, and it's frankly terrifying to the Northern readers, because who can see this a practice as something that's just convenient? And worse still, what is more convenient? Traveling across the ocean and capturing more slaves afar, or just traveling a few miles upstream? This idea is quite frankly terrifying to the Northern readers, and it suits the Liberator's purpose quite well. Another statement that has the potential to make the Liberator's message one of immorality was published on May 7th of 1841. It states that many masters have boasted that they have lain awake on purpose to invent unheard of cruelties and tortures for their slaves. This definitely showcases the ethical issue and the cruelties of slavery, but it also furthers the image that the Liberator is trying to paint of the slaveholders. It's similar to the previous argument of they are criminals and psychopaths who don't want running around free. It made the issue really a moral concern, but it's quickly followed by a deeper idea a week later on May 14th of 1841. The world is waking up to the horrors, religious, social, and political, of slavery. He that goes along with this movement will be sure to be successful, but whoever opposes it shall be overpowered. This statement makes a sort of everyone else is doing it, you should too, plea against the slaveholding practice. If there's a war that's going to be fought, you need to be sure that you're on the majority side of it, that you are fighting against this horrific practice. Everyone else recognizes that these people are evil and cruel and sadistic. The side of the war that is coming, that will be fighting against it, because that's the side that will be victorious. The Liberator shortly after resumes its previous exhibition of evidence against the political practices of slaveholders in its October 3rd publication in 1846. The article states, "Slaveholders are willing to sustain the operations of the American Board of Foreign Affairs so long as they can make it subserve their purposes. And the fact that the board is nothing loath to be used by them should open the eyes of the people to look at the entire rottenness and corruption of that body." This is an accusation against not just slaveholders, but also against the entire American government system. It's stating that the federal government is not doing its job keeping its citizens in check. This impression appears to notice that the influence of slave owners has in fact spread just as Garrison said it would a decade prior. It makes the idea of slavery spreading to the North all the more realistic. This escalates slaveholding from being a shady business practice a million miles away valid and it's scary. In the April 4th issue of 1851, the Liberator made an explicit accusation against the whole South, not just against the slaveholders. On the first front page of its issue, the paper states, "Look at the South. It is all there. The evils and characteristics of slavery are alike. Look at the effects of slavery upon yourselves. At the South, see a blasted soil, deserted homes, and a broken commerce, all united to seek the system first." This statement begins the train of thought that they're going to follow for about a decade, saying that it's not just the South, it's not just the slaveholders that are to be blamed. The whole region is so deeply intertwined in the practice that it's unable to be helped. It's completely absorbed with this, and you can't be feeling sympathetic to the innocent sometimes because they don't exist. The sympathetic arguments against having a war that a few handful of elitists should not bring devastation to a whole land is nullified by this statement. In March of 1856, the intentions of the Liberator were examined by its readers, and their interpretations and arguments were published, specifically on March 21st by Garrison. This gentleman said, "There are few classes of men so unfortunate and so wrong as are the slaveholders. When shall I come to scatter the darkness of the false education? Not from the South, for the whole South is enveloped in that darkness. Such are the circumstances of the unfortunate and wrong slaveholder whom the North is confirming in sin, instead of bringing to repentance. And he is not to be pitied rather than scorned and hated and shunned. The anti-slavery men spend quite too much of their time in denouncing the South. The reformation of the South is indeed among their legitimate aims, but their first duty is to reform themselves and their neighbors. Are we to refuse to even discuss the question of slavery with the slave owner? Reason and religion forbid such treatment and such abusement. Mr. Garrison, though seldom wrong, errs in my judgment at this point. He would discuss this question with the Northern politicians and the Northern doctors of divinity." This statement is making a counter-argument against what the Liberator has been preaching for the last 30-some years. This is a counter-argument against him, but it does a good job of showing what exactly he is arguing against. This idea that the entire South is corrupted. And in doing this, it does in fact further Garrison's argument that the South is so deeply intertwined. They are blinded by this practice, and at the time they have there's no expectation of them to suddenly right the wrongs on themselves, and Northern intervention is necessary. While Smith was advocating for a different approach and more of a compromise, Garrison is arguing for a complete and total reform of the system and reform of the Civil War. Beginning in 1831, the Liberator gave its readers a narrative that gave them an acceptable reason to hate the South and all slave owners. It did this gradually. It would frequently plant one seed after another. It would introduce an idea that our readers would go home and think on, and okay, that makes sense. I can get behind that. And then it would build up some trust over time, just being a normal newspaper. And then it would introduce another idea that built off of the previous one. Okay, that makes sense. I can get behind that. And it gradually introduced these ideas that would previously have seemed ridiculous and radical. It also did a good job of creating an us versus them complex. It created a sense of otherness between the Northerners and the Southerners. It separated the two so that it wouldn't feel like we're attacking our own nation. It wouldn't feel like we're attacking innocence. Its readers would just see that what we're going to do is attack the enemy, attack a bunch of psychopaths. We're going to take down these criminals. And you can't just say that to begin with. What we really wanted to focus on is how that progression of ideas made this possible. If Garrison had begun with, well, slave owners are going to take down the entire American system, nobody would have listened to it. It would be radical, ridiculous. And that's part of what makes this so powerful. That in one lifetime, they changed a man's mind from being impassive and just, yeah, I don't think slavery is that great, to feeling passionate enough about the anti-slavery movement and the abolition of the Southern culture as they saw it. And needing to put an end to it, raising up arms against it. Northern subscribers to the Liberator fought the Civil War to destroy a corrupted system led by slave owners that had poisoned an entire region beyond repair. And they were able
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions for Hallie Smith after that? We can take a break. Oh, yeah, Professor Knudsen asks, where was the Liberator published again?
It was a northern paper. I don't recall the exact location. I think it was
Austin, that hotbed of abolitionism. Great. John asks, how does this paper relate to current events?
Thanks, Dr. Douglas. I appreciate that. So what we can really take away from this is how it relates to current issues can be seen in things like the local problem of the market house. This, if you had said decades ago when they first started campaigning for it to be taken off of graduation certificates and off of currency, people, it was a struggle then. But now we have Black Lives Matters painted around the whole structure. They had begun with that, just as if Garrison had begun with let's fight a war. It wouldn't have been successful as it has been now. You have to gradually work up to these things. And I think we have a nice example of that right here. Does that answer your question?
People assume that it answers your question. That is such a slow, funky mechanism. I have a question for you since we have 3 minutes. I know you knew I would. I'm curious. The market house is actually kind of a wonderful example here because I'll stare at the screen even though Hallie's right there. I actually could be wrong about this, but I actually think that a majority of people in Fayetteville, say 40 years ago, not even a majority, but even people who would put themselves on the side of civil rights and would later come to think Black Lives Matter, I'm not sure they would have seen the market house as being as much of a problem as they now see it. And so I'm wondering if you see this, what the Liberator did as more of a rhetorical strategy, where, as you said in your paper, they plant seeds so that later they can convince people to go ahead, or do you see it more as a process of polarization and radicalization, whereby they start out thinking Southerners, slaveholders are the problem, and then eventually they come to see the whole problem as the South almost together?
Very good question. I think it's a combination of both, and I think that both can be seen throughout different examples. Sometimes you see one more than the other. I think, especially given that nice quote I had early on from the perspectives, that I think that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts. I think that it could be that you start off with the creators of the idea are on the more extreme side to begin with, and they do notice the change in all of their followers. Most people didn't begin with the current or the most recent stage in mind, but they got there eventually, whereas there could be somebody leading the idea all along with the end goal in mind. And I don't think there's always somebody that has the end goal in mind. I think it's just we want something better, something more.
In a normal presentation, we would have already clapped for Hallie and said what a great job she's done, which I think she did. But for now, yeah, there we are. For now, we will take the clapping as given, and we will shift over to our second presenter of the panel. After our second presenter, we have lots of time for questions, although if it devolves into mere virtual mud throwing, we're lucky. We can cancel you people as quick as we want. Sorry, that's just a joke. Our second presenter is Mujahed Aghbar, and he will be presenting a paper entitled Climate Change and International Security.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming. I'm going to try to share my presentation with you. So for those who don't know me, my name is Mujahed Aghbar. I am from Palestine and I am a triple major of financial economics, business and marketing. I've been to over 25 countries around the world, and a lot of this research has been based on first-hand experience besides a lot of journal articles. And I want to thank both my supervisors, Dr. Knudsen and Dr. Wayland, for helping me in this project. Um, so some facts about climate change. A lot of Americans believe that it's a big problem, and that a lot of them also believe that it is caused by human activities from all ages. There's a big majority of that. There's also a big majority of Americans think that the global warming impact has already begun, and we can see it all over the world. I just try to use Americans, since most of my audience are from the US. Also, a lot of millennials and Generation X believe that global warming will pose a serious threat in their lifetime. So many people think, oh, climate change will not happen anytime soon. I'll be okay by the time it happens. I'll be dead. I think it's vital to recognize that the impacts are already here, and thus we need to find solutions for it. And obviously with the demand for that, that means that we can provide solutions for this, and there's a way for innovation, there's a way, new opportunities for that to happen. And part of the solution will be ceasing the use of fossil fuel. I'll be talking more about fossil fuel later. But I'd like to discuss first about global capitalism, since it has a lot of influence on the human influence in climate change. So when the economy has started to develop in the world, some small minority of people became super rich, and a lot of people became super poor. For those who attended my 1% taxing the 1% and income inequality earlier, probably know more about this now. But I think colonialism has been a big part of the issue. Foreign power maintaining basically political, social, economical, and cultural domination for an extended period of time. We'll have more examples later on that. And the new form of colonialism is called neocolonialism, which is basically continued dependence on more industrialized nations. And they basically use their managerial and technical expertise of these former colonies to ensure that they can run their system in a way. So capitalism creates inequality, and it basically threatens the poor more than the rich, obviously, because they are the people who have the most to lose. There's this theory of Wostein's world systems, and it was recommended by my sociology supervisor, and it divides the worlds into three categories. So one category is the core, the semi-periphery, and then the periphery. The core countries, as we know, are the main big countries, including China, including France, USA, Germany, Japan, and Canada. The semi-periphery is China, India, Pakistan, Ireland, Mexico, and Panama. And then the periphery one is most of the countries in the world, including Afghanistan, Vietnam, Palestine, Dominican Republic, the Philippines. And we can see how a lot of the material and the cheap labor is being exploited from these countries into the core and semi-periphery. And obviously there's a competition between the semi-periphery and the core. It's not as strong, obviously, but we can see now China is obviously stepping in with that. And on the reverse, they sell them with high profit consumption goods for these people. We use marketing into that. We just buy stuff for very cheap, and then we triple or quadruple our profits. And that makes a big inequality and in the world generally. So this style of existence in the world, I feel like, creates a lot of domination for the core countries and on the semi-periphery and the periphery countries, and it creates dependency on that because these people are, their main weak, and the rich are getting richer. These countries are getting more developed, and other nations are just dependent on that for the most part. I think it's vital to recognize that the world and every human in the world is not an equal polluter. And I think traveling has made me see a lot of this, because 3/4 of the emission come from 12 countries, and the UN is just treating everyone the same, treating all these countries as equal polluters, but it's not the case, because not everyone has a car, you know. As we mentioned earlier, a lot of the population, their net value is less than $10,000, or the net worth. So obviously people contribute to climate change, and their carbon footprint is different. Um, so I think the UN must take further action of identifying these countries. There's obviously the Paris Treaty of climate change and all this stuff, but still there's more to be done into this. Um, and it's not like we're keeping records or grades over here. If carbon exists, it's gonna hit everyone. It's not like, oh, I made X amount of carbon footprint, so then I'll be judged for that. It's everyone in this, and then the poor is gonna be affected the most with it. Meanwhile, those who have the resources and the infrastructure for it, they will be able to resist it, because, and it depends obviously for the GDP and per capita and the infrastructure of the countries. Some countries are able to handle catastrophics better than others because of their technologies and science. Other countries barely have enough to eat. And I think it's vital for countries, if we're trying to save the world, or if we're trying to sustain humanity in a way, I think it's vital for the wealthy to help the poor to survive. I think during my visit in Vietnam, I learned a lot about how a lot of companies tend to exploit cheap labor in Vietnam. They're using their cheap access to land. Also, the like policies of environment are not very strong over there. So a lot of it is, you know, a lot of companies don't care. They just dispose like their contaminated material in the rivers, and that creates pollution in the ocean, in these natural areas. And I think this is one of the problems that maybe Vietnam is dealing with now. Pollution is a big thing actually over there. People just wear masks even before the pandemic, because just the air quality is very bad over there. And I think this is, I think it's beautiful that globalization has offered us the possibility of investing in different countries and being in different places, but also we're also creating jobs in different countries. But this is creating an economic dependency that some people are now enslaved for the capitalist system, enslaved for these corporations, and these corporations can always threaten, oh, well, if you like increase the taxes or force us to pay for carbon offset, then we're going to leave your country. And people are like, no, don't leave. You know, I think this is again the new form of new colonialism that we experience nowadays. Another thing about globalization is, for example, in the US, we buy a lot of products, and even everywhere in the world, we buy a lot of products from China. And that takes obviously the shipping and the cargo, the planes, whatever we do. And then we had to take, we don't know what to do with this trash, because we don't recycle for the most part, and we have to export this trash to other places, including China, or paying some other countries like Argentina to dump their trash. And I think that's just basically throwing our stuff to other people, and other people have to deal with it. It's just creating a vicious cycle of again, the wealthy versus the poor, and what type of infrastructure who has it. um, so I think it's vital to recognize at this stage that the wealthy countries have contributed the most to climate change, and the poor is going to suffer the most. The picture on the left is actually in Sudan, and we're going to talk about it in a bit. So resources and climate change. So if we don't take care of this issue anytime soon, there's a probability of increasing the temperature of the globe for Celsius, which is basically that's no human intervention. We don't try to cut you know, our carbon by any means. So basically 26% chance of conflict risk will increase if we maybe try to recycle and take care of this. There's 2 degrees possibility, and that's 13% risk of increased violence and conflict. So these conflicts were like, but it's just weather, right? Like, why should I care about this? But then if you think about it, these weathers are, you're talking about crazy like droughts, crazy floods all over the place. And I think these people will not have enough food basically. And when people starve, they just fight with one another. We constantly understand the idea of scarcity of resources. The less resources, the more competition we will have. And I think we already see it now in multiple countries where if these poor people don't have enough resources to feed, violence is going to exist, and it's already happening in multiple countries. We can see it in also like now with Latin American countries like Honduras and Guatemala. People are facing a lot of issues with climate change and drought and unsuccessful crops, and they're trying to come to the US or to other places. And I think the media is completely not sharing this. And I think it's vital to understand why is the world going to this. And also this whole idea of potentially being a refugee or a future refugee through climate change. I've been working with a few organizations with that. I think it's very important to be prepared for what's coming with the catastrophes all over the world. Um, so with higher risk of climate change, there's higher risk of economic instability, and this makes global security and peace harder to achieve. So capitalism is one of the interesting concepts. I'm an economy major, I'm an economist, and I also really think about learning about sociology and how it influences the world generally. And I think it's very interesting how the rich and the poor nations are influenced highly through climate change. A lot of people don't realize this, but climate change have contributed 25% larger than it could be, larger income gap between the developed nations versus the developing nations. Um, so we know obviously crops grow in optimal areas sometimes. For example, it's not too hot, it's not too cold. This is the optimal for crops to grow, or basically just a good thing for people to thrive, just good weather. And obviously for warm countries now, there's gonna get warmer, or they're gonna face more severe problems, including floods and other problems, and this makes it worse for them. For example, in Sudan, this picture in the background is in Sudan. They are the biggest losers currently from climate change, and we've seen the flood recently in Sudan. They lost almost 36% of their GDP through global warming. India follows with 31%, and Nigeria by 29%. This is a tremendous big number, guys. I think many people don't understand how influential this is, especially these countries are already poor, so they need the resources and the money to sustain the existing system that is already struggling. And I think with climate change, you're just making it worse. Norway is a winner in this situation. Norway is one of the cold countries, so now the weather is getting better for them, and their GDP increased in 34%. And Canada is the second one with 32%. Russia is catching up also. Russia is a big country, obviously, so it could be influenced both ways, I guess. So on colonialism and climate change. So for most of you who probably know, I'm from Palestine, and I think Palestine is facing a big issue with colonialism and climate change because most people don't even have access to their control of their land or natural resources. They're limited by what type of technology is being used, and most of the lands are being exploited by Israelis. I mean, it's a colony state, so it's all about maintaining control over the people. Um, and I think it's just climate change is just not a natural phenomenon. It's not simply an economical one either. It's also a political one that is increasing injustice and inequality in the world. Um, and we can see that Israel, for the most part, is denying Palestinians to have control over the resources and land, and just making them more vulnerable to leave the land. Or, I mean, if you're lucky, if you can leave the land. But for the most part, it's ethnic cleansing based. So it's like if you don't die from colonialism, you're gonna die from climate change type of situation. I think climate justice is necessary and vital for the survival of Palestinians and the survival of multiple nations as well. Um, when I was in New Zealand in 2019, I sailed on a sailing boat around the Pacific, and we been to both islands, and we met with a lot of indigenous people, mainly the Maori and the Maori people. And the Maori people is suffering through a lot of land theft basically to start with, and then there's also their culture is just destabilized, and they're marginalized economically, socially, and politically. It's threatening basically the very existence of these people, and they're losing a lot of their human rights and equality. I think one thing that is very important to mention that you can tell from their access of resources for the most part. For example, with their healthcare and with their education, that these people are more likely to suffer from like heart diseases or health problems, and their access to such resources is very important for them to survive. Obviously, it makes it so much more difficult for them to have that when you have a hierarchy of who has what access to. And also the suicide rate and mental problems is very high, and there's also a very high rate of addiction, because these people's idea of indigenous people is basically giving back to the land, not abusing the land, giving back to our to Gaia, to the mother nature, to this living entity for them, and just being grateful and thankful for everything we have. Meanwhile, the capitalist system is completely the opposite. It's all about exploiting resources, just taking as much resources from land as possible and making the most money for certain people, while other people are just enslaved for the system. So I feel like a lot of people would struggle from this point, that the suicide rates is just be like, everything I believed in, everything my nation has believed in is not true. The world is changing, and just people get into substance abuse or just mental problems or suicide. And I think that's a big problem. So what can we do? I think there's multiple things, multiple ways we could throw through this. I mean, you could choose what type of world you'd like to live in. I personally would rather ride my bike and be off with carbon, try to reduce my carbon footprint. But it's up to us. We're in this together, and I think we should try to support as much as possible those social entrepreneurs who are trying to make the world a better place. I mean, there are a lot of ideas to create energy. Technically, I believe we can be carbon free by now. It just the industry of fossil fuel is very profitable and is keeping a hierarchy in a way in the world, and this is why we don't have access to such technology yet. Um, Advocate for tax incentives, also carbon offsets, carbon taxes for governments, and government programs and social entrepreneurship support that. Also, I think it's vital to recognize that there is a myth of innovation that only comes from a free market. So someone has to invent it, and other people have to follow it. It's kind of true. Like you can see it now with Tesla. For example, when this first started, now the electric cars is booming all over the world, but electric cars has been there for a few years now, but it's just people were not taking the initiative of it because I said fossil fuel industry is very profitable, and there's a system to be sustained in a way in the world that is at least trying to be sustained. Um, Fun fact, most of your phones have touch screens, and these touch screens were 100% funded project by the government. So that means if the government initially pushes for such innovations, obviously we can have these technologies by now. It's just a matter of, again, ensuring that this is interesting for everyone. And I think this is why, as the people, we have the possibility of choosing what type of leaders we have. A lot of politicians now are actually changing to become more about like carbon free and offsetting carbon as much as possible. There's a lot of plans. It's just the fact that we need to act sooner than later. We can't wait too long. The free markets and capitalism, I'm not against them necessarily. I just think that capitalism destruction might even actually do more harm than good. Um, I believe that capitalism and the free market, if it has been implemented equally and it offers equal opportunities for everyone, it could bring a lot of innovations, a lot of energy, a lot of adaptability, a lot of technology for everyone. But if we continue with this whole idea of hierarchy, then it might be difficult to sustain um, just our world, and the peace in the world as well. I also think that we should hold certain companies accountable for pollution. Where there's always lawsuits going on, and I think the people should be more considerate of what type of companies we're buying from to start with. Are these companies using child labor too? Because it's not only about climate change again, it's all about income inequality and colonialism, because it all intertwines with one another. Um, I also thought about the using energy as a commodity, so you can use kilowatts actually to tie the currency with, or even use it as a currency itself. Because back in the days they used to use gold, and then because of war and all these situations, we stopped using gold. And I think if we use energy as a commodity, that would make the world such a better place, because then we can use it will create a lot of jobs basically with all this. With all the new innovations of air turbines, solar systems, solar what's the word? Um, well, solar energy creators. Um, so yeah, this could create a lot of innovation, and I think this would be a good idea. It's also one way to create Bitcoin. It's I mean, a lot of countries now are rejecting Bitcoin because it consumes a lot of energy. But if we can make a carbon-free energy, and we can create a lot of money through that, so I can see the idea already being implemented in the world. And the last thing is be resourceful. You have a lot of potential to say the word, and I think you shouldn't diminish your value of a person to make a difference. There's the three R's of recycle, um, reuse, and reduce. Thank you so much. So these R's are your friends. Keep them, and also always try to just fix things. Don't replace it. Also, don't fall into the capitalist system of you constantly need to consume. You're happy where you are. You don't need all this material stuff to feel happy for yourself. And there's a lot of beauty out there. We humans are very resourceful. We can make this together if we put the effort and the cooperation into it. I would like to thank you so much for attending my presentation. This is a picture of me in Franz Josef Glacier. It's threatened with, it's melting, it's losing a lot of mass of the glacier, and I think it's very important to, just mention that. But yeah, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Thank you so much.
Everybody. Thank you so much to Mujahed. Here we go again with the clapping that is nowhere near as much as either of our participants deserves. If it's okay, if people have questions, we'll continue to pretend that my authority means something, and I'll ask you to put them into the chat, and then I'll ask them so that you can hear them, and then I'll ask each responder to respond as appropriate. John Edwards asks, I assume that this is probably to Mujahed. Is it capitalism or corruption that is the problem? Communist China, for instance, is one of the biggest polluters in the world.
I think it's both. You can't deny it. I mean, the whole idea of capitalism is creating value for certain people, and I think you can't deny the fact that I mean, corruption goes hand in hand also with capitalism, because I mean, the whole idea of capitalism is feeding the human ego in a way of becoming a stronger person, of being richer than other people. So I definitely believe that both of them go hand in hand. Obviously, capitalism is a good thing, as I mentioned. Like, destroying capitalism can do us more harm than good. But I think it's vital to acknowledge also the fact that your privilege as a person is a result of someone else's misery. And for you to have a coffee, or for you to have a certain product, someone else had to work for it. And I think it's all about the idea of sustaining balance, sustaining this whole idea of capitalism, and directing it towards innovation and helping people, rather than just blame other countries about it, because we're in this together. As I said, I mean, I'm from Palestine. My country barely have any resources in this, and we're going to be one of the first people in the world to be hit by climate change. So I feel like throwing fingers at people that you did this, I did this, I think is not the best idea. Instead, we should take initiative for actions, call these big polluters out, sue them, and then I don't know. I think it's just really bad, and I think I'm happy to listen if you have any better ideas.
Other questions? Paul, how about you just yell it or?
Yeah, we'll all use the word here, just say it. So, have you looked at public relations campaigns where, like, because I would consider the Liberator, like, that's sort of a public relations campaign to promote the need to have a civil war, right? And so, have you looked at, do you see any parallels with other public relations campaigns, like in World War I, for example, or other wars? Wait, sorry, I have to unmute. Okay. I hope that makes sense, that question.
I think I understand your question. What are other instances of this same idea of what fits? I'm going to be very honest with you. I know a little about a lot of things, but I don't think I'm the right person to answer the question.
Fair enough. I know that other more by
It's abnormal, I know, but as a history major, one of the least like items of my interest, the thing that I don't want to say avoided, but just not pursued has been the wars, the whole war section of history that everybody thinks is the most interesting. I kind of just sidestep that in favor of, I apologize, that's not something I can overly address. I apologize. I'm sure it would have been great for a lot of people.
I'll jump back in. Dr. Klein asks, I assume again to Mujahed, how do you think being a third world country relates to risk for experiencing the effects of climate change? Or do third world countries take on more of the consequences of climate change?
I think third world country is probably a miss saying of the word. I'd rather say developing countries, maybe, just to be politically correct, But I think the reason is obviously the infrastructure, that a lot of the developing countries do not have the resources to just be able to deal with the consequences of climate change. For example, drought. If we don't have enough access to resources and we don't have the money for it, then people will starve. And that gets you into the whole idea of neocolonialism, that we need to take debt now from another funds, and that's just another method of control. You're just basically putting people in debt and be like, oh, if you don't apply with our rules, then we're not gonna fund you anymore. The other thing that you could look into is just like floods and just drought generally. That's a big problem in the Middle East now, and a lot of problems are being created because of that. And if we don't have access to the technology, then these people are screwed. And this is a great chance for the core countries to just come and be like, oh, let's save you. Let us like use a bit of this new technology, and we already use your resources, so might as well just like control you a bit more. I think it could be very scary, how it could go. And this is why I feel like the world needs one another. We need to cooperate more, because otherwise it's just catastrophic for everyone.
I'm going to jump in. I will take my self-proclaimed moderator's privilege, much to the ill of everyone else, I'm sure. And what I'd like to do is to think about the way that these two papers perhaps speak to each other in a way that I think is really interesting. Mujahed has written what in some terms might be called a polemic, which is where he looks at the world and argues that something must happen. And polemic is a bit of a dirty word, so there's another word for that, which is policy paper, which is, again, you look at the world and argue that something must happen. And what I find is really interesting is that Hallie's paper is examining people who were writing polemics themselves or policy papers. And what I find particularly interesting is that Hallie's paper is about people who were trying to upset and destabilize global security. So I suppose my question for Mujahed is, it, specifically is, what the heck is the good of global security? You said, I'll quote, you can choose whatever world you want to live in, but I don't think you mean that any more than William Lloyd Garrison might have meant, I don't care whether you have slaves or not. Does that make sense? I don't call you out on that to discredit you, but rather to your credit. I don't think you think, and I think it's appropriate that anyone ought to be able to choose to do something to someone else's detriment. And so that's what I would ask you to think about, but I would ask both presenters to consider what might be the virtues or the consequences of revolutionary change. What Hallie is discussing in her paper is a movement that led to the Civil War, which did in fact kill hundreds of thousands of people. But on the other hand, the Civil War was vastly accelerated the death of slavery in America. It freed hundreds of thousands of people. And so I'm curious, what are the consequences? And I'd like to hear both respondents think about this. What are the consequences of pursuing revolution? The consequences for democracy, for maybe the way that people write and think about themselves and others, and for opportunity for, I don't know, let's say the widest number of people possible. So I'll do some fiddling with the mute button and
I think that's a very good question. I think that not taking responsibility for actions is a big danger, because again, throwing fingers at people will just delay action, you know, and I think inaction is also an action. It's a decision that we make that we are responsible for, and the future generation, our kids, are going to be suffering from it. Just again, you can be like, oh, like I'm gonna die anyways in the next, I don't know, 20 years or 10 years, depending on how old you think or how old you're gonna live and how healthy you live and start with. But I think taking responsibility is very important. I think there's nothing permanent in life but change. I've learned this as I traveled and I've been to places, and I think that systems and those who are into anthropology, culture and history, Dr. Pabon is here also, could definitely tell us more about this, but history constantly changes, and it's always the people who get to choose their destiny. I think this is what I'm advocating for at this stage, that we need to cultivate unity in our lives and cultivate taking action, holding people responsible again. And also as a customer and consumer, you can always get to choose. You are the one who controls demand. You are the one who can make companies invent things or make companies not invent things. And this is how you can start by yourself. I'm not telling you go outside and, I don't know, burn these like factories or whatever. I'm not supporting any of that stuff. All I'm saying is just be conscious of what you're doing and be conscious of what you're buying. I mean, there's a lot of children's slavery, for example, with like the chocolate industry. I think there's a lot of things could be done, you know, and just being educated and informed is vital for our survival as humans.
A very deep question of right and wrong. I mean, everything we do has consequences, and if it's for good or for bad, I think that, putting our two specific topics aside, but whenever you do anything, especially when you intend it to have a large scale consequence, there's going to be both good and bad results of that. And what are you defining as good or bad? I mean, it kind of depends on where you're sitting, where you're standing, and what you're looking at. Is it, do the losses and the wins outweigh? I mean, it depends subject to subject. So that's something to consider. Like, your right isn't necessarily someone else's right.
I will be a jerk. I will notice that Dr. Edwards points out that Mujahed's response is actually very capitalist. It's possible that both he and I, in our very different ways, are trying to turn us all socialist. I say that only to poke at my colleague, Dr. Edwards. But I do think maybe there are some starting premises, right? One starting premise is the capitalist starting premise, which is that people ought to be able to, within certain limits, act as they want. Another starting premise is, let's say, democracy, and people being able to choose. I suppose where democracy occasionally intersects with capitalism, their nation's destinies. But I would ask both of you maybe to turn away from good and bad, and not necessarily towards the dark side. That I understand that that's a very Emperor Palpatine way of thinking of it, but rather consider actually what results from revolution. Does what result from revolution? Mujahed has presented it as in the guise of or through the lens of global security. In slavery times, the people who were preserving global security were the slaveholders. They kept the economy running as efficiently as it ran. They produced all the cotton that England needed to keep the industry of the world running, with all the horrors that came with that. I wonder if you will push yourself harder. Ignore good and bad. Consider maybe founding principles. Principles you want to choose.
I can go if you want me to. Yeah. I think you're right. You know, I don't think it's about good and bad, but I can just watch the world collapse and act like there's nothing going on, you know. And I'm not advocating again for like necessary a revolution. I feel like it's a very strong word to say revolution. But all I'm saying is we need to ensure that certain people have access to resources before it's too late. And obviously, all I'm saying is just being conscious of how you're using and what type of products you're buying and all that. And again, the 3 R's, you know, reduce, reuse, recycle is your friend. Always think about that, because otherwise, again, we're just putting ourselves in this hole and we're just pointing fingers. My approach might be to a bit capitalist, maybe because I've been in the US for a while and just getting Americanized in a way. But also, I mean, I feel like money rules the world in a way, to an extent. You know, like what type of how much do you have, and what kind of access to resources do you have, and what kind of things you could do. And it's again supply and demand, regardless of what you want. Innovations happen because of supply and demand. People want this. An entrepreneurial person think about it, he invents it, she invents it, and then someone else have a new product. And I think it's vital to think about the approach in a logistics sense, at least.
That this can go to looking at 2 different types of arguments. There's the quantitative, there's the logistics, there's the statistics, the numbers of that, the amounts of cotton, the your numbers, and then there's also the emotional argument, the emotional appeal. And you know, how does it make you feel as and that's got different responses, because everybody is looking at it from their perspective and how it's going to impact them and how they're going to respond to that. And you have to consider both of those arguments, because we can all sit around the table and look at the spreadsheets and the facts and figures and agree that this is what's happening. But coming to an agreement about how we feel we should move forward and the compromise between those two things is difficult, because something being the right thing to do and it being the easy thing to do and it being what you want to do and what the smartest choice to do, that's something very, very situational. And I think that's something every round table has to really consider.
Thank you. My apologies. Are there other questions, since I've darted the entire thing for myself? Other questions for either of our wonderful presenters? Becky King writes, when thinking of what results from revolution, I wonder what the tipping point for one is. And I wonder if either of our responders might speculate.
very person to person. I think that, I don't think a lot of us have like a specific number in mind. We don't walk in knowing if they say this number, I'm gonna buy the car, right? But you hear it kind of, oh, that's my point. Whereas that could come later for me than it does come from my friend, my brother, my sister. It comes different for every individual, and I think that again, it's very situation based. But this isn't as situation based as it is personally based. What my tipping point is, what Dr. Emil's tipping point is, what everybody in the Zoom chat tipping point is, going to be different. And you don't go in knowing what it is. I don't think a lot of the time. I think you know it when you see it.
We say tipping point, are we assuming like the trigger of the situation? Okay. I think injustice is probably the biggest one, and just being unable again to feeling helpless, probably feeling that you need to support your family, being unable to have access to resources again, being unable to feed your family and on a massive scale. And I think this is why it takes climate justice is a big thing that is supposed to be worldwide, because it might be not your problem now, but soon it will be. At some points it will be. It's just gonna continue going unless you act on it. And I think we can sit and watch. We can sit and estimate that people will still struggle, and pain has existed in the world for a long time. But we could also say that climate justice needs to happen. It's going everywhere. I actually participated in a march in Boston for climate justice, and I think there's a lot of the new generation is conscious about this problem. So I definitely think obviously like injustice is a big factor of it, but also more about accessing your basic rights, including housing, food. All this stuff are going to influence it. Obviously, I think the tipping point would be happening more when uh, the core countries are hit. Obviously, they have more infrastructure to handle it, but I mean, we can see from the tornadoes and all the stuff that are hitting both coasts. And in the US, for example, it's a thing that is influencing a lot of people. And I think when it starts influencing the privileged, it's gonna start. These people will start feeling how the non-privileged people are feeling, and this is when the time we have to take an action and as humanity unite to save the world, which might be too late. But I hope we make it.
Wonderful. I'm about ready to wrap this up, but are there any final questions from anyone? All right. I want to salute both of our presenters. They have done such a good job. They're a wonderful model of what a liberal arts education can do. So thank you all very much. Clap that won't disrupt our mute buttons or anything.
Best of luck.
Thank you.